This episode is proudly supported by Westholme Australian Wagyu. Whether you're a chef or just love going to restaurants, you know the best ingredients are everything, especially when it comes to beef. Westholme, based in Queensland and the Northern Territory, Australia, is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. They steward 16 million acres of rangeland, guided by the natural ecosystem where cattle graze and forage on native grasses for the first few years of their lives. The result is high-quality Wagyu beef that reflects the terroir of Northern Australia. Westholme believe that when nature leads, flavour follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Peramang, Nudgeri and Kaurna people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Many people's vineyards in the Barossa and many blocks you will find these patches of greatness, but you have to know they're there, but then you have to pull them out separately because you will then get something very unique and special.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Amelia Nolan is the Managing Director and winemaker of Alkina Wine Estate's Barossa Valley, an ambitious project that launched into the Australian wine scene with one hell of a bang. From the get-go, it's clear Amelia means business, and Alkina Wines has been gathering momentum ever since. Hi Amelia, thanks for joining me.
Hi Shanteh, how are you?
I'm really well. It's so nice to have you on. I remember very clearly the first time the wines ever crossed my desk at Key, and I was like, whoa, holy hell, who are these people and what's going on? And I've been following along ever since. So I'm thrilled to have you join us.
Oh, thank you very much. And I'm glad the wines had an early impact on you. That's fantastic.
They definitely did and have ever since. Tell me a little bit about, you are originally a Limestone Coast girl. Where did you grow up and what was your life like as a child?
Well, I grew up on what was originally a sheep farm in just out of Narracourt, east of Narracourt, which is in the centre of the Limestone Coast in the Rattenbully wine region, and I had a very happy upbringing. Actually, we lived on a farm. We had sheep. Dad went into crops and then eventually vines. My grandparents and great-grandparents had farmed the same area, the same farm. So I grew up in a town surrounded by, I suppose, friends and family that you have from being fourth generation people in a community, and it was great. It was kind of simple but great. I went up to boarding school in Adelaide when I was about 15, and then to university where I did an arts degree majoring in literature, English literature, and then I did wine marketing at Roseworthy, the college that is the Adelaide University college renowned for sort of winemaking courses, viticulture courses, etc., which was great.
Wow. I'm always fascinated because I certainly haven't had a life near a farm and I'm very much a coastal girl. So I'm always kind of fascinated to see how somebody that grows up with a lot of space and a lot of land is often pulled back that way, even if perhaps their life in between, gravitates towards cities and travel. I often see that people that grow up on a farm tend to kind of want that kind of space later in life. What does you said that your father first was involved in sheep, then crops, then vines. Why the change over time? Because that must be fairly difficult to reinvent what you're growing and what you're doing.
Well, I think every generation to farmland comes with their own ideas about what the land is best used for. And down in that part of the world, it's actually, the farms aren't huge, but the land is very high quality. There's very good rainfall, which is pretty unusual in Australia, and there's very good underground water in those big limestone aquifers and caves that we have down there. So I think Dad thought that he could get a better, I suppose, output from the land and he didn't really love farming sheep or cattle. So he went to lucerne and a couple of other crops, and then he really loved the idea of having vines. And it was during the 90s when I suppose the Australian wine business was exploding on the international markets, and he thought he could become a grower, which he did, and we still have that vineyard. Our family still owns that vineyard now, but it's a vineyard that we use to grow grapes that we sell. So very much a crop rather than an end. And I certainly would say that I have. I lived in the city in Adelaide. I travelled a lot when I was here in my 20s to cities and places all over the world when I was working for what was BRL Hardy. And then I ended up in London for 11 years. And then moving back here, I absolutely felt compelled to be in open spaces and on a farm, which I am often, because the vineyard, it is a farm. Alkina is a farm ultimately, and I feel very comfortable being back in a rural agricultural kind of environment. But it is funny that you do. I feel a bit full circle-ish, I suppose.
I mean, I think it just goes to show how much those early memories impact you, and perhaps you don't realise them till later on. But tell me a little bit about studying English literature and what pulled you to going, actually, I think I want to talk and think a little bit more in terms of farming and grapes.
Well, I think I was very young when I finished school. So I just turned 17. And I mean, that doesn't happen now. Kids are kind of 18 when they finish or older. And there was no such thing as a gap year. It was, what are you going to do? What are you going to be? And I didn't know. So I think my parents just sort of placed me in a holding position. And I'd always been good at English and the arts, I suppose. And so I did that. And it was it required reading a lot of books. And I didn't, after I finished that 3-year degree, I didn't read another book for quite a long time. But it was, I mean, really, I look back on it now and I think what a joy it would be to go and do a basic literature English degree like that as a mature person. But of course, there's no time. But yeah, I did a lot of Australian literature, Irish and American literature, and I can't remember it all. But it got me to 20 years old, and then I had to work out a vocation, and it wasn't going to be anything related to the degree I'd just done. And I thought the wine industry. I was getting into wine. I grew up in a very wine environment. We drank wine. We were half an hour from Coonawarra. I'd been collecting wine since I was sort of at the age of drinking, and I thought, well, I'll just go and do that. And I did the marketing. It had a lot of winemaking and viticulture stuff within it, but it was a 2-year course, and it really just got me a job in the wine industry, which was the mid-90s. So, and a very exciting time in the Australian and South Australian wine industry. But of course, it was a time when were thinking quite differently to how we think now. So it was, I was 25, 26, no, a bit younger than that. And it was when there was the huge export boom of of the kind of Australian Chardonnay and Shiraz and Cabernet, and basically sunshine in a glass. And I got a job in the export department at BRL Hardy as a marketing assistant, and we still had fax machines, and I learned how to export wine and sell wine overseas. So that was my first job.
Well, you certainly did learn how to export, because you went on to a pretty impressive career after Hardy's, which you secured that job in 1995, I believe, and then in 2006 you made another big change, heading over to London. You became the managing director of Argento Wine Company. How did that come about?
Well, actually, I moved to London in 2001 with Hardy's. So I moved, up the ladder, I suppose, in the export department at Hardy's during the 90s, and then I realised from all the travel I was doing that I was one step removed from the hard, cold reality of the market. I was kind of doing the nice, fluffy stuff back in head office, and then I'd go to the markets and I'd tell our marketing teams in the US and the UK and parts of Asia, now this is how we're going to do this. You need to do this, and they would sort of look at me and go, "Well, that's not going to be possible because the market just doesn't work like that." So I felt like I was missing a big piece of my education. And I begged to be sent anywhere. And eventually they let me go to cover a maternity leave in the UK office of Hardy's, just for 6 months. And so within about 3 weeks, I packed up everything and moved over there. Knowing that was just my ticket to ride. I wasn't coming back in 6 months, and I got to the UK office and very quickly realised that I knew nothing about nothing, and that actually I had a lot to learn, and that being a kind of, I suppose, happy, smiling, charming 28-year-old Aussie chick wasn't enough to get to do business properly with big British supermarkets. You needed to know about stuff like category management and rate of sale, and you needed to come up with marketing plans with big trade marketing investment plans and consumer marketing investment, and you had to have objectives and strategies, and I didn't know what either of those words really meant. So it was a big learning curve for me. And then Constellation, the big American company, bought out Hardy's while I was working in the UK office, and I stayed on, set up a premium wine division within that, and then eventually I just didn't think I could. I didn't really fit in the super corporate American corporate environment. So I was recruited by the people who ran Bibendum, a brilliant British wine distribution business, to run their joint venture company, the Argento Wine Company, which was a joint venture that they had with the Catena family of Argentina. And the brand at the heart of that business was called Argento. And it was, I suppose, Argentina's first attempt at a proper wine brand, a commercial wine brand. And because of my commercial wine brand background with Hardy's, I had the knowledge and know-how to run a brand. It was sort of trying to be the Jacob's Creek of Argentina, but of perhaps a slightly higher, more artisanal level, but still it was all about big business with supermarkets and so on. But I learned a huge amount. It was a completely different kind of business in the end. And I learned a lot about exporting, again, back to selling Argento all over the world in 50 markets, building a team, and then eventually setting up production in Argentina so that we were self-sufficient. And that was all extremely challenging and interesting.
Being that we consider Argentina as a bit more of a youthful, which is kind of ridiculous, but a youthful country in terms of wine, did you feel that you were able to kind of grow with them and what they were doing rather than being that small fish in the large pond of the kind of US and London kind of companies?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, Argento was at one point the largest export brand out of Argentina. So we were definitely a bigger fish. But yeah, it's quite a contradicting place, Argentina, because one moment you feel new worldish, new kind of pioneering. You're pioneering the export effort where Australia's was very developed. The next minute you are out talking to growers and you realise that you're actually in Southern Europe, and you're not in the New World by any means. It's actually a very European, Italian feeling, Southern Italian feeling place. Some people refer to Argentinians as Spanish-speaking Italians, and I think that's a really good description, actually. So that was interesting. And confusing and challenging and very, very stretching for me. A huge learning curve to do all of that in a country that's not my home country as the producer country. But it was, I learned so much.
Definitely seemed like somebody that bites off a big bite when you go into something.
Well, why not?
Well, absolutely. Why not if you want to accomplish big things? But I mean, learning or working with over 55 countries and distribution throughout all of those, do you have to really approach each market completely separately and understand the workings of that market before you go about doing what you're doing?
Yes, you do, actually. You will only ever do so much business with a market if you treat them like an export market. You actually have to get your head into the way that that market works. Can you sell your wine in both the on-trade and the off-trade, or do you have to choose one or the other? What kind of investment do you need to make in that market? Is it are there ways of doing business that you're never going to understand because they're so in-house and internal and may involve a different type of business that you might not engage in? It is very important, and you can't actually understand them all. You have to choose what you're going to understand and the ones you're going to really focus on, and then work with good people and develop good relationships, because it is, after all, the wine business is all about relationships.
Mm. Yeah, and I can see that, because I imagine, you only have so much time that you're allocated to all these different markets. So you really do have to trust the people on the ground that know what they're talking about and have lived in these countries and understand their culture and the way that they operate. So I can imagine, like you said, that those relationships that you build are so important.
Yeah, they are. And also the team you build. That is everything almost. And then it's empowering people within your team to go spend time in the markets and get their own understanding. As the person running the business, you can't expect to get into that level of detail with everything. So you have to then employ people who you can empower to build the relationships and to be in the market and be the face in the market and so on.
Amazing. I'm always curious to ask people who have been an expat or spent some time overseas, when was the moment you realised you wanted to return to Australia? Because I think it's so different for everybody. So why the pull back to Australia, and how did that all unfold?
It was it's more of a personal thing. I think I'd had my first child in London, and he was about 1 when I then realised I was having another baby, and I didn't think I could go through having a second baby in London, in the UK medical system, actually, which is brutal, and I needed to come home to my family. And my husband who's English, had been ready to come back here for quite a long time. So it was only me holding the show up, and it was really, I mean, when you have a boy and they start to be active, you realise that you're going to need more space and sunlight than what life in London allows you. So I think that's when, and I think we had 6 bad summers in a row, and the weather and the lack of sunshine really drained me. And I held on, but in the end, I was dreaming of sunshine. I had a deficiency, clearly, but I wanted to come home because I wanted my family and the children that I raised to have access to the great privilege of being Australian.
I'm amazed you did a year, before. So
yeah, I know.
Now, the story of Alkina doesn't happen overnight. So there's some pretty interesting names: Alejandro, Alberto, Pedro. Lay the story straight for us of how Alkina came to pass.
Sure. Well, actually, it relates back to why I wasn't able to leave London in maybe a bit earlier, but we were building Argento up to, we wanted to sell it. It is difficult to do business in Argentina as a foreigner and as a foreign company, and we knew that at the very least we would need an Argentinian partner. Our original partners had gone, and we were just a British company running a business in Argentina. So we really wanted an Argentine partner. And in the end, we sold the whole company to Alejandro Bulgaroni, who I now work for and who owns Alkina now and from the beginning. And he had been buying vineyards and wineries in Mendoza and other parts of the world while in the last couple of years that I was running Argento, and I had met him a couple of times through some contacts in Mendoza, and it looked like a really good fit. And eventually we sold him Argento, and I said, well, I'm going now, sign here, I'm leaving for Australia tomorrow. And I'm 34 weeks pregnant, and we can talk after I've had the baby. And he was very open to that. I came back here, took a bit of maternity leave, and then talked again to him, and we talked about what I could possibly do from Australia because I obviously wasn't coming back to London, and we agreed that I could do some work in Asia. Obviously, that was a well-worn track between Australia and China at that stage in sort of 2012, 13, etc. And then eventually we agreed, he agreed that establishing a winery in Australia would be a great idea, especially to give us access to the Chinese market, which is rather ironic now. So we wanted to buy something, and he said, work with Alberto Antonini, who has been a great mentor to me and a huge part of the thinking on everything we've done with Alkina. And Alberto actually had owned something in Australia before himself personally, so he knows it well. And we started looking to buy a complete project, a finished winery, etc., a brand that already existed. But nothing was quite right. Nothing was quite what we wanted, because we wanted things done in a certain way, and it would mean changing something that already had a track record and baggage and etc. and a history. And in the end, an old farm up behind Greenock in the Barossa came on the market with old vines, only 6 hectares, and some slightly younger vines, old buildings built in the 1850s, all in a state of complete disrepair, but with undulating hills and not that flat country that, I like hills because there's always interesting rocks and stuff in hills. And so Alberto and I proposed to Alejandro that we buy this property and that we develop it. And he agreed to it in late 2014, so nearly 10 years ago. And so we got on with it, and we finalised the sale, and we sat down and said, right, what are we going to do here? And we agreed that we had, the big idea was that we would create a single estate, that we would farm without chemicals ever from day one. It had been kind of abandoned, so we didn't have to kind of take the vineyard off. Yeah, I mean, we had to go through the process of getting certification, but it was fairly straightforward because it hadn't been sprayed or even irrigated for a long time. So we agreed we would do that. We agreed that we would endeavour to make wines that were very deeply reflective of the land, and to do that we would bring in Pedro Parra to do the mapping for us, and that we would build a small winery with a lot of concrete, and that we would not ever use new oak, and certainly not new American oak. So that was our vision, and that's really what we've been doing for the last 10 years, is creating that vision. And we opened to the public and launched the wines in 2020, so 3.5 years ago.
Well, it seems very straightforward and simple. I don't know why more people don't just go about doing what you've done. No, I'm kidding, of course.
No, it just hasn't been very simple, that I will say. But it's been very rewarding and very, at times, challenging. The first 2-3 years were all about kind of boring stuff like securing water, which the property didn't come with an allocation of water. So I had to secure an allocation of water for it. The Barossa vineyards get their water through a pipeline which is owned by a private company called the Barossa Infrastructure Limited. And you need to buy shares in that company, and you need to get an allocation of water. And when you secure that, you also then need to build a dam to hold your winter water in. And we had to do that before we could do any of the interesting developmental work, because without water, you have a very different looking project. And that all took some time. It took a year to get council approval to put a dam in. But once we got going with that, we could then start developing vineyard and planting Grenache, Shiraz, Semillon, Mataro. And we started to restore the first building, and then once we'd got that looking good, we could plant some lawn around it and build the garden behind it, and we sort of kept moving east across all these buildings that were in a state of disrepair until we'd finished. But it's a lot of working out how to do it, how to cost it, how to do it financially sensibly, what kind of council approval you'll get step by step. It is a lot of administration and financial management, actually, which is boring, but ultimately necessary.
100% necessary. I'm fascinated by this story, and I've got so many questions to ask you about Alkina and your wine, so I will definitely get to that. But I'm just fascinated by the fact that even though Alberto had some experience in Australia, you were kind of the Australian beacon for an Argentinian, for Pedro. Was there a lot of pressure to get it right because you were the person, in Australia that knows the land and the places? Did you feel that pressure?
Yeah. Oh, yes, absolutely. I've always felt that it's ultimately completely my responsibility to get it right and deliver the end product, or at least the stand it up, and certainly commercially, it has been my role entirely to build a team and to start selling the wine and to start telling the story and start explaining what we're doing. And all that storytelling and I suppose, of course, establishing a distribution platform. There are no advisors for that. that. The advisors for me, are in the way of viticulture, terroir, winemaking. No, I have had to make sure that we can stand it up commercially, and with the help of a brilliant team that I've built, and that's critical. The team here, we talk a lot about Pedro and Alberto, of course, because they've been so significant in the advice they've offered and the work they've done, but actually it's all underpinned by the strong team we have here, and also by the fact that Alejandro, who's the owner, has trusted me to create this project for him as a very, very Australian project, and has not at any point really questioned the style of what we've done, the look, the feel. He has completely entrusted me with it. I report very well to him, but and certainly, obviously financially and with updates, but he hasn't ever asked me to create a mini Argentina in Australia. He finds people he trusts in countries outside of where he lives, and he relies on them to deliver a genuine project and product, which is quite amazing.
It is amazing, and also brave and fearless and lots of other descriptors I could use. What was the reception? And now you launched in 2020, which wasn't a particularly fantastic year to launch a brand new brand. But tell me a little bit about the reception of the Barossa community, because you've had some really beautiful, long-established families and people that are part of that framework. And it was so ambitious, like you said, that, you came in with some really strong morals about what you wanted to do and how. So what was the community like when you kind of shared what the vision was?
Well, I think there may have been some eyebrow raising, but actually I think my overwhelming feeling looking back is of genuine support for the project. And I think it's because of the way we've restored the buildings, the way that we've restored an old vineyard from being potentially ripped up. A 70-year-old vineyard that wasn't protected in any way and could easily have been pulled out by someone else who'd bought the property. I think that the very sympathetic approach we've taken to the restoration has gained us the respect and also the Barossa community is a large group of people who want to eat and drink at nice places. So we've broadened the repertoire of I think options. I think people wondered what we were doing all the way over on the other side of the highway in Greenock initially, because that's another world over there. But actually, it's not that far in the end. And I think that there was probably a bit of eyebrow raising around the Pedro Para project, but I think we've had time now to explain that we haven't got the benefit of multiple generations of understanding where different patches of dirt are on a farm. So what we wanted to do was fast track our knowledge of that. And I think so lots of people understand their terroir in the Barossa. I think what we've done is we've gone to the next step of actually separating it very specifically and picking the bits, the polygons separately and making them separately. So to make 4 wines from within one block of Grenache is a very unusual thing to do. And that was probably the thing that had people scratching their heads the most. When we had the pink tape out in the vineyard and we had the pickers within the pink tape and they were only picking that section because that was limestone and the rest of the block was not limestone. But I think that the Barossa community have an overwhelming commitment to the well-being of their region. And a rising tide lifts all boats. And there's very much an attitude around that. And so if someone comes in and does something that builds and enhances interest and reputation of that region, then you've got the support of most people.
That makes so much sense. And I do believe that, like you said, the way and the respect that you've shown to the place you're on, to the land, to, like you said, the historical buildings and restoring those, you can see that you are not trying to transcribe something from somewhere else and plonk it down, where it doesn't make sense. And I agree. I think what Alkina offers is completely different. So for the brands in the market that were already doing what they've been doing, this is just something on offer that offers certainly a lot of research and education that perhaps wasn't there before. So I think, I can see a small brand going, well, that's not what we do. That's probably in a different competitive market to us. And like you said, a rising tide.
Lifts all boats. A rising tide lifts all boats or ships.
Thank you. I just forgot the last bit. It's a great saying. Tell me a little bit about Pedro Parra and the micro terroir expert, because you only need to look at who he's involved with to realise he is total freak, but amazing. And then tell me a little bit about what that means for kind of the polygons, because I think we can only probably touch on some of your wines today. And I think that that's a really great example of just the level of detail you're going into to put these wines into people's hands. So tell me about Pedro Parra and the polygons.
Pedro is an out-of-the-box individual who I've got just enormous respect for. He can be difficult and challenging, and he can be frustrating to work with, but he is an extraordinary individual, and what he's taught us and taught me is I just can't imagine learning that much from anyone else. So Pedro was introduced to me by Alberto, who has worked, they've been friends for many years. They worked together in Argentina, in Italy. They've been very connected for a long time. And that is because Alberto realises the enormous benefit that Pedro can bring to a wine project. So because Alberto and I always wanted to showcase the real terroir of the Barossa, we needed to bring in Pedro to find it for us. We started, Alberto introduced me to Pedro in 2017, and in order for him to come and do the work he wanted to do at Alkina, we had to firstly get the property fully scanned by electroconductivity mapping, a system that he's worked on closely with some guys in Chile who came out and stayed with us for a few days, brought their scanning equipment and drove them and scanned the whole property, uploaded the data onto their software, and that then spits out a whole lot of maps that really shows in a lot of detail where the soil changes. So when they're sending down their electrical current down to 75 centimetres and a metre 50, it then puts readings back to the ability of that current to move through the earth. That means we could tell where we had sand, where we had rock, clay, etc. And then Pedro comes out with that all uploaded, all on his system, on his computer, and he stayed in the house at Alkina, and we went out into the vineyard. He'd already told us where to dig the pits, so we'd put in about 60 soil pits. We have our own mini excavator, and we had put in these pits 2 metres deep and 3 metres long, and we started walking around from pit to pit to pit with Pedro and his pick, and he stands in each pit and he looks at the fractures in the rocks or in the clay, and he looks and then he goes back to his computer, and then he goes back to the pit. And We started by doing an intensive study of what we call the old quarter, which is those 6 hectares of old vines, focusing in on the area on the ridge, which was especially the old Grenache block. That is 1.3 hectares. And he went into the pit that is now Polygon 3. And I said, what do you think? What do you think? I wanted to know, was it good? Was it good? And he said, I've been into 20,000 pits in my life and only 5% of them are as good as this stuff. And this is limestone. And I said, that's amazing. That's so exciting. And he said, and I also think you have a Ferrari and you don't know how to drive it, which meant that it was a big compliment, but also massive criticism because we had made some wines from the 17 vintage, which was a tough vintage because it was very wet. And he said, your wines don't match the quality of the terroir. So the first thing he talked to me about was irrigation. And he said, you are irrigating in a conventional way. That means that your vines, your wonderful old vines, are just eating in the topsoil. You are putting 8 hours water on a week during summer, and they're just sucking from their superficial roots up the top here. And he said, look, get in a pit and look at where the roots are. There are tiny, fine vine roots all the way down to 2 metres, and they go way further than that. These guys are what are eating. They're what we want to be doing the eating, not up the top. He said, the top up here is McDonald's. Down here is Nobu. You're not eating Nobu. You're eating at McDonald's, and that's what your wines taste like. So that was interesting to understand that, and that was the first of what's now been, I think he's been out 4 or 5 times now, and every time he comes for 3 or 4 days and we look at the wines, we go back into the pits, and I'm completely a zombie by the end of it, because he is also obviously with his work around the world expanding and growing in his knowledge. So there's always something more that he's got to add, and there's always a new area for us to explore. But the first part of the process was to make the polygons that we defined in his first visit separately. And he said, you've got a block here. It's, if we go back to the 1.3 hectares of Grenache, of old vine Grenache, he said, what you've got is mainly schist, which is a metamorphic rock. He said, it's beautiful, fantastic. And within the fractures of the schist, you have clay, because the clay is the child of the schist. So clay is made from degraded schist. So all rock weathers, and the weathered schist turns into clay through lots and lots of chemical processes, but ultimately it turns into clay. He said, in some areas, like Polygon 4, you have actually got mainly clay with some very degraded rocks. In Polygon 5, you've got mainly schist rock, very fractured, and clay in the fractures. And then he said you have this very special patch, a vomit of limestone in the corner of the block. And we don't know how it got there. It's unusual. Some of it would be probably wind blown from millions of years ago, and the rest of it could be just some sort of sedimentary deposit, because it was all an inlet, a sea at one point, a shallow sea. So he's not a geologist in that he doesn't tell you how it got there or why it's there. He just says it is there and this is what you need to do. And so we sectioned off that. That's Polygon 3. We made Polygon 5 on its own, and then you've got Polygon 4, the clay section, and then another couple of areas that go into Polygon 2 that are very hard schist, and with a limestone capping that's definitely windblown. So you've got these 4 geological areas within a block. And he then asked us to make them all separately. So pick them separately and vinify them separately. And his advice also brings with it, pick this part earlier. Polygon 2, you need to watch it. It'll have dry tannins. Don't give it too much whole bunch. Polygon 3, you need to give it a certain amount of whole bunch, but not too much. as in not 100%. We use very high levels of whole bunch, so not much is 80%. And anything with clay that's dry clay needs to have a lot of whole bunch so that you can cut through the richness and sweet character of that wine from that dirt. So he would say to me, Polygon 4, red clay, dark stones. You have the sun of the Australian sun beating down. You need to have the whole bunch because it helps to cool the fire. So he talks a lot in metaphors, which is actually really good when you have a language barrier as well. So that was fascinating in that we changed the irrigation, so we changed farming, and then we picked these geological patches separately, got them into the winery in 2018, started using whole bunch for the first time, and wow, the results were just mind-blowing. I'd never expected to create 4 completely different wines from within one block.
I mean, it sounds like when Pedro visits, you need to record everything he says so you can digest it in tiny bites because there's so much information.
Yes, you do. And I have recorded quite a lot of the stuff he said to us, yes.
That's good because then over the year you can maybe get through it all. But, I mean, totally fascinating and, to be there to listen to that. But then also, I mean, I don't know if he's tried the 2022 Polygon 3, but I hope he has. And I hope his feedback was very different from that first. I think you know how to drive that car pretty damn well now.
Yeah. Yes. He's very happy with that wine. Very happy.
Man, I mean, I can only count 3 other Grenache or Grenaches that I've ever had with the clarity and crystalline finesse that wine has. It is so incredible. And also, I think you can get so carried away with the aromatics of that wine and then think, oh, it's just so pretty. And then you look at the palate and it is just another beast entirely. It is just, truly sensational. And to watch those wines change over the course of since your release is incredible. I do want to ask a little bit about concrete. You mentioned concrete earlier, and it was not necessarily about the slabs you put down for the winery. It is a very different type of concrete. You have such different vessels. You've got concrete eggs, tulips, amphora, Quervi, Gamba, Foudres. You've got a lot of money in that. No, that's not what I mean.
We do.
I mean, there's very, very decisive selection about how you don't mess up what you've done in the vineyard and be able to transpire what's happened there into the glass. Can you tell me, for people listening, what is the difference between concrete eggs and tulips, and how does that affect the wines?
Absolutely. So the concrete tulips, from the very, very first moment of talking about the winery, Alberto said to me, you have to get some concrete tulips. That is the first most essential thing. Call this guy, Francesco, and he will sort you out. So I started working with Nico Velo, who are an Italian, originally a concrete company in construction, who then got into making wine storage vessels. And the interesting thing about, firstly about concrete is that it goes back to the original vessel that wines were made in, which is the clay amphora. So that's the original inspiration for these vessels. Concrete is less porous than clay, but it is porous. And that's the fascinating thing, I think, for Grenache in particular, is that I don't believe it works that well with, I don't believe that oak flavour complements Grenache particularly. I think it takes away from the delicacy and the fine details that you were just talking about. For something like Polygon 3, you lose some of that very special, unique detail. And it's also, Grenache needs to be made in a relatively enclosed. It can't be made in an oxidative environment. It needs to be. It needs a little tiny bit of oxygen, but not too much. So this concrete is fantastic because it has porosity. Oxygen can be exchanged, but not as much as you would get with an oak barrel. And the other great thing about the Shanteh Wale vessels is that they have inbuilt heating and cooling. And they are, as far as I know, the only concrete vessel in the world that has got heating and cooling built into the sides. So you could put a heating plate, cooling plate into any vessel, but these are, or you could buy a stainless steel vessel with heating and cooling. But these vessels are concrete, and you can control the temperature. And this is great if you're using whole bunch, because whole bunch can, a very hot ferment with a lot of whole bunch you could end up with those bunchy characters, which we don't want. But if you can cool your vessel down, you can keep the temperature of your ferment at a low enough level to avoid that. So they are great for Grenache. We also love them for Shiraz, and I mean, we've made rosé. We do our Semillon in them as well. And then for maturation, because our polygons are so small, you can't get a Shanteh Wale small enough. The smallest we've got is 1,200 litres, which is still quite small. But we managed to get 3 non-blot eggs, which is 700 litres, and we've also got a 500 litre non-blot concrete cylindrical vessel, but it's the eggs that we really love. They're 700 litres, and we generally get at least 700 litres of polygon 1, 3 and 5, and so they go in there after they've been pressed and racked, etc. They go into the eggs and they stay there for 12 to 18 months. And look, some people believe that the wine moves itself because of the ergonomic shape and the natural shape, and it moves in a spiral and that kind of thing. We see that in ferment. I don't know if that happens genuinely in an egg once the wine is finished. But it just works. It's a great vessel, and we find that it builds within concrete. The flavours, the structure tends to build over time in concrete, whereas in oak we don't see that happening as well with Grenache.
Fascinating. I mean, I have a million more questions, and I've already almost had an hour of you to myself, and I haven't even scratched the surface of the more things I want to know.
Has it been an hour? I hadn't noticed.
I honestly, it's one of the reasons I love doing this is I actually get to have someone to myself that I can ask all these questions, and I just learn so much. But incredible. I think that the communication that you're doing for all of this very, very nerdy wine stuff is amazing, because I do think even the booklet, it is talking about lots of detailed components, but it's done in a way that I think you make it very accessible for people to understand, okay, why do I need to know that, and how does that, what's the result of that? And I think that that's so important to connect what you're talking about so that people can then see it in the glass. And the polygons, it is so important to know about those little tiny plots and what's beneath the surface to understand the wines. They're delicious for sure, but you would miss so many nuances if you didn't really understand about your approach and what you've done in that vineyard. So
yes, well, that's true. And I think the message we're trying to get to people that's really important for me, and I've only really understood this from Pedro in the last couple of years, is that not all terroirs are born equal. So limestone is a very special type of terroir, but if it's in a block with clay, you will never see it if you pick the whole block together. The block will deliver a result which is the same as the clay. And the clay is more Premier Cru. The limestone is more Grand Cru. Now, you can't ever see a Grand Cru wine if that area is picked within a Premier Cru. Everything goes back to the lowest common denominator when it comes to terroir. And I think when people thought, well, why are you pulling this bit out and making that separately? It's because if it's picked within the block, it won't be as good a wine as if it's pulled out separately. And what we want to do is we want to show that the Barossa has got extraordinarily complex and interesting and fascinating diversity in terroir, and we want to show that diversity, and we want to show that within many people's vineyards in the Barossa and many blocks, you will find these patches of greatness, but you have to know they're there. And lots of people know where they are in their vineyards, but then you have to pull them out separately, because you will then get something very unique and special. Just picking blocks or multiple blocks together gets you really good wines, but never truly great wines.
Absolutely incredible. Amelia, I have loved chatting to you. I do have one last question for you, and that is about what you like to drink. If you could only drink 3 beverages for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
Well, that is a very interesting question. 3 beverages. Okay, they would be champagne, of course. I mean, the thought of living without champagne is horrific. For red wine, I love the wines of Burgundy. Chambol-Musigny in particular is my thing. And the other thing would be a really crisp, dry, but light white wine. It doesn't need to be complex. And I love the charcoaly wines of northern Spain, of the Basque country, that, you go to a tapas bar in San Sebastian, and the guy pours it from up high and it goes in a kind of tumbler, and you drink it with great tapas, and it's the best drink you could possibly have on a hot day. And so they would be my 3 things. They'd give me enough variety and cover enough occasions, I think. To cover me off forever.
I like that. And you've got 3 different price points too. You've got something very accessible so that you're not forking out for Chambol every day.
Exactly. No, that's right. I don't need that every day. And I'm a nice grower champagne that's nice and dry. It doesn't need to be a super big name. And then the Charcolis for every day after work would be perfect.
Well, you certainly are the right person for the job at Alkina Wine Estate. You are a wealth of knowledge and an absolute weapon, may I say. It has been such a delight talking to you, Amelia. I hope we get to meet and talk more in person down at Alkina sometime.
I hope so. Yeah, you must come and see us. You really must. Anytime, you're welcome.
It's definitely on the to-do list. I think for any little wine nerds out there, it's just a beacon that they are attracted to. So thank you for your time. It's been a delight, and cheers to you.
Thank you, Shanteh. Thank you very much.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram at overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.